All right, let's begin our study of world religions. Tonight introduces the subject of world religions. Next week we get on to our first one that we'll look at, and that'll be Islam. But tonight we start with just a good introduction to the world religions. First, some definitions. Make sure we're on the same page. When we talk about a religion, we're talking about a system, an organized system for the worship of some kind of divine power. Now, there are all types of religions. Each one has different structures, different ways they operate, but they still have common elements that you'll typically find. And so you're going to have some kind of deity, some kind of power that's greater than ourselves. It gets defined so many different ways. But still, there's something that's bigger than us, something that has an authority over us, an accountability, so that your life and its destiny is somehow in the hands of whatever's up there. And so every religion will have something along those lines, a deity which is organized around. There's always some beliefs and practices, things we believe because we believe in this divine power, and things we do because of this divine power. And so there'll be the beliefs and practices. And then there'll also be some kind of source of their knowledge and thus their authority. There may be prophets. There may be some sacred writings, but something that is the source. We go back to this, and that's where we know what we know about our faith. Pretty typical across the board for all the different religions. And so we're accustomed to that in Christianity. We have a belief in a God, and we define him using the Scriptures. We have our beliefs about the world and how it operates, about ourselves, about salvation. It comes from God. We have also practices we do. And then we've got our prophets, and we've got our holy writings, our Scripture. Now, that's religions. As far as denominations is where you take a religion, any religion in the world, and they start to divide from themselves over some differences of opinion. It could be different views of the deity or different views of some particular belief or practice, but next thing you know, you've got a group that's split. Now there's 2, then there's 4, and as they keep splitting. And those are called denominations because that's what the word refers to. It is a separating of 2, and thus there's 2 different values. So in our pockets, we've got our dollar bill, our $5 bill, our $10 bill. Those are different denominations. That is, they're all in common. They're all paper money, but each one has a different value. There's a distinct distinction between them. All right, so every religion divides into denominations. Now, as Christians, we're accustomed to Christians and the Christian denominations. Maybe we thought the rest of the world doesn't do that. They do. Islam has divided. I'll talk about some of that. And Judaism divided. And Buddhism and everyone else, there are always dozens and dozens of the divisions, the denominations. Which means it's a challenge for someone like me to try to describe a religion to you. Let me tell you about Hinduism. Because what I'm trying to do is to try to capture something that really covers dozens of different groups who don't agree on things. And then I'm going to try to, so what do they hold in common? At least most of them do. That's always the challenge of teaching a religion study. Now, one more division is the cult division. And this is used in all religions. All religions have groups they identify as the cults of their religion. The word cult, the Latin word, originally referred to just simply a spin-off. That is, here's the main body, and here's a group that has spun off of it. And it really didn't carry any particular connotation with it. It just simply referred to, they used to be part of the main body, and now they're somewhat separate. But over time, it took up a negative connotation. They are separate, and thus they are unorthodox. The main body is the true orthodox body, and you are something else. You're a break from the truth. And so the word took on that kind of connotation. Now, in the book of Acts, that word, cult, is used for, well, the church. Because we were Jewish until the day of Pentecost, and then those 3,000 Jews then began to follow Jesus Christ as the Messiah and this and that. And, of course, we would have never thought of ourselves as a cult in that modern sense of the word. But when Luke is using it in the book of Acts, the early version of that word, it doesn't have any connotation to it. It just means it is a spin-off from Judaism. And so the Roman Empire recognized us as Jewish, but a Jewish spin, if you will. Now, the cults are hard to define in some ways because it's a subjective call. It's basically a matter of opinion. When does a group that divides from the main bodies, the main orthodox positions, when does a group get so far away that you start put a cult label on them. Well, that's a call that you make because you think, well, they're just got too many differences from what we originally started with, and so you throw the label. Now, no cult group wants to be called a cult, right? So they're going to argue against the label, but those who feel like I'm closer to the center, that's the ones who will throw the cult label out there, but even then won't always agree on which ones get the label. Now, that happens to every religion, not just Christianity, that you've got these splits. Now, let me tell you something else about religions. For the most part, if you just wanted to know the major world divisions, that's just a small handful. As far as any religion over time that has grown to be a significant number and a significant force, it's very small, and I'm going to show those to you in just a moment. Most of the religions of the world are small and insignificant in the influence they make. Now, there's hundreds of religions, hundreds of religious groups out there, and some of those religious groups would be 1,000 or less. Now, we're talking about worldwide. There's not a lot of those guys, are there? If they're 1,000 or less. That's why you're not likely to even run into them. That's why I don't spend a lot of time teaching to the ones you're not going to actually have to know, right? But there are just a small handful that actually have a significant size. Now, what will happen is sometimes these small, insignificant ones, they'll make the news because of something they did. They're still no big size, and they probably won't even be here, years from now, but still they made the news. So let me just throw one out there for fun, just see what you remember. Does anybody remember Branch Davidians? And what do you remember them for? Waco, Texas. Yeah. They're holed up in their armory there. They got their guns. Next thing you know, the thing catches on fire, and all the lives lost. And the only reason we know Branch Davidians is why? Just because they were a news story. Let me tell you, their size was so small that it is not just simply less than 1,000. It was only a couple hundred of them. Fact is, they had split so many times, there were other branches, all of them using some variation of the name of David or the name Koresh or some other name from about that period of biblical history. But basically, they couldn't even stay together among themselves. They had split, and they all were tiny. But that one caught our attention because of what happened at Waco, Texas. Otherwise, we wouldn't know about them. There's a lot of others that are like that. Even one that, you go back and say, but I thought everybody knew. They remember Moonies? Unification Church, Sun Myung Moon. Boy, they must be big. Actually, they never did get big. For all the press they got and all the people writing and talking about them and what they did, still their numbers never got very high. In the U.S., you're still trying to work your way up into the hundreds of thousands, never close to anything close to a 1 million mark. They were always small. And Korea, where they came from, Korean government didn't like them at all, kicked them out. So there are not very many over there. You get the idea. As much as we knew the name, they weren't really a force, not as far as numbers. Or go back to Hare Krishna. The Hare Krishna groups, what do you remember about them? Yeah, airports wanting to give us flowers, or actually they'd say give. Now, you're supposed to give a donation, of course, or that flower comes back. But there they were. They're at the airports. They were sometimes dressed in orange robes, this and that. In the United States, it's just a few hundred of them. That's all it was. Never did catch on big. And if you're saying, well, where'd they come from? Well, it comes from India. It's a Hindu background, but there weren't Hare Krishnas there. This was an Americanized kind of thing. It never caught on. Are you getting the idea? That most religions, even if we hear about them in the news, they're small, they're insignificant, not a lot of impact, though some occasionally make the news story. Now, just to give you an example of just how small and tiny and strange they can get, out in the Pacific Ocean, there is a chain of islands, and they've got a religion. Can't remember the name of it. I just know what they do. They worship John F. Kennedy. Now, remember John F. Kennedy? A lot of you in this room, you go back far enough, you remember when he became president, this was going to be a whole different America. This was the hope that finally politics, as we know it, is behind us. America is going to move into a golden age. They called his administration Camelot. Remember all that? I mean, he was looked at, this is going to be something different. This many years later, I'm thinking we're still waiting on that guy that is something different, right? We're still waiting on a president who comes in and actually fulfills what the hope, but he was the one they had the hope in. And so think about how he fit a mythology that lends to a religion. Here's the one that's going to bring hope to the nation and to the world, and then he gets assassinated. There's a Jesus Christ kind of story that happens there. And so in the Pacific, where he was very much revered in that, he is part of the story of the war in the Pacific and the PT boats and this and that. And so his story is down there, and American aid and such is down there. So there started in this chain of islands the rumor that he's coming back. Kind of a second coming kind of thing, whether it's him in person or some kind of reincarnation or the spirit of. And so they began to put up the pictures and have the shrines and have the religious rituals for John F. Kennedy. Now, why have you never heard of them? First, maybe you haven't vacationed down there. Second, because there's only dozens of them. It's just some of the inhabitants of some of these little islands way out in the middle of nowhere in the Pacific. But it illustrates the world is filled with hundreds of religions who have some kind of power above us that they gather around, beliefs and practices that they do, and then something they'll claim as the voice that speaks, some kind of prophet or scripture, and that's the story of world religions. Well, we're not going to worry about all those hundreds, are we? We're going to focus on the key ones, the ones that you ought to know about. Now, let me then show you numbers. Numbers tell a story, and the numbers here I think are fascinating. As far as the world is concerned, the number one religion in the world by numbers is Christianity. Hey, we're number one. Does that feel good? We're number one. Now, let me tell you what it takes to be number one. It takes everything out there and that big, broad umbrella that calls itself Christian. So you've got to take, not just simply like here, Church of Christ. You've got to take all Protestant groups. You've got to take the Roman Catholic Church. You've got to take the Orthodox Church. You also have to take the cults. And anything else there that somehow, some way uses the name Jesus Christ and is some kind of spin-off, variation, whatever. Put all of us together, and then we get to be number one. And yet in that number one, there's a lot of us saying, I don't particularly like you, but yeah, it takes all of us together to finally come up with that this is the largest religion in the world. And you see the number there, 2.2 billion. Now that's significant, and I will tell you, significant in the world population. World population is somewhere around the 7.4 billion. So we're about 1/3 of the people on this earth are under some form or version of the name of Jesus. But if you're into missions, world missions, you can see there's about a 2/3 that's not under the name of Jesus in any form or manner. So there's where world missions always has still more yet to be done. So Christianity is number one. And that's not bad when you consider there are religions on this list that are much, much older than Christianity. We have 2,000 years. But you've got Judaism goes back an extra 1,400 or so before that. Hinduism goes back another 1,500 before that. Buddhism, another 500 before that. Christianity not doing so bad, coming in a little bit later in history. Look who's number two, and let me ask you this, does that surprise you? Number two, Islam. That's why we're going to study them first. 1.6 billion. Now let me tell you why that's an amazing number. Of the major world religions, Islam is the latest, came along later. Now, historically, let's back it up. So we start with Hinduism. Somewhere back, 1500 BC is the date they use. Of course, everybody says we go back to the creation and God, of course. But still, working with realistic dates, about 1500 years before the coming of Christ. And then Buddhism is going to be about 500 years before the coming of Christ. Islam is about 600 years after Christ. They get the latest start, and they're already up to number two. When people talk about the growth of Islam and feel threatened by it, you get some idea of where that's coming from, don't you? As far as a world power, they have taken off and run. Now, some of that, of course, would be families who stay within the faith. Some of that will be a conversion where you choose to become Muslim, and then they had their periods of history of the Holy War, the Jihad, and they would force the conversions. You convert or you die. And so for however they got there, they took over a large portion of the world's faith, 1.6 billion. So we will definitely be studying Islam. Now look who comes in at number three. Number three, Hinduism, 1 billion. Now Hinduism, the oldest of the living world religions. There were religions before Islam, but that's your ancient religions that died away at some point. Islam, of your current living religions, comes in at 1 billion, and so the oldest of those. Now let me tell you about this Hinduism. Hinduism is pretty much India. That is to say, it does not export well. It doesn't sell outside of India. And Indians are just simply born into it and they accept it. most of their numbers are in India, or it will be Indians who have migrated elsewhere as they're following jobs, and they take Hinduism with them. And when they get to the elsewhere, they'll build their Hindu shrine, but they don't convert people to Hinduism. Hinduism doesn't attract. And so at some point, I'm going to give you a study of Hinduism, and when I explain their beliefs and practices, you'll probably get an idea of why it is not very many people convert to Hinduism. It's so far and so different in thinking from what most everybody else understands about religion. And so, who cares about Hinduism? Well, if you're a missionary to India, you do. If you're the church in India, you're going to have to deal with this, because in India, the population there is 90-something% is Hindu, and of the tiny percent that remains, that'll be Christianity, Buddhism, and anything else. They're all squeezed into the small percentage. So, Ajay Lal over there in India, this is what he's dealing with as he's trying to convert people to Christ, Hindus. So Hinduism, a significant religion, but primarily focused on India. Now, coming in at number 4, just under a billion, about 750 million, there we get to Buddhism. And Buddhism is a spin-off of Hinduism. It's an example of where Buddha, he's a Hindu, but he doesn't really believe that they've quite got it all figured out. He's seeing some things that lead him a different direction. And so he'll take some Hindu ideas, but he'll create what we call Buddhism. And so it's later, 500 years before Jesus, but it does pick up, and it does come up to a sizable growth. Now, that's your top 4, and pretty much you could stop right there. Are you looking at the next numbers? Once you get past 2.2 billion, 1.6 billion, 1 billion, and 750 million, there is no close number 5. It just drops radically. You know who's next? The Jains and the Sikhs. I put the Sikhs down for you, the Jains coming in close to them. Now, the Sikhs, you say, who even knows who they are, what they are? Actually, I'm not even going to teach about them, because you see the number? That's still relatively small compared to the huge numbers we've already studied. And it's from the northern area of India, the Punjab area. And really what makes them distinct is where in Hinduism in India, they're into the many gods, the plurality of gods. These people decide to go back to just one God. So they're monotheistic, which makes them distinct. But other than that, there's not much more to tell you about them, really. And you're not likely to be running into them. They show up occasionally in movies, though, because if you ever see, for example, Indiana Jones, whatever, you got those guys looking Indian, and they got those curved swords slicing it. They're usually Sikhs, just because they have a reputation for that, so they'll use them in the movies. But otherwise, you're not going to run into them unless you're looking for the Lost Ark or something. Now, you got the Sikhs. They're coming in next, but see how distant of number 5 they are, and the Jains, which are coming in like right there with them. Now, you get to Judaism. Judaism is always listed as one of the major world religions. They get the title major. I think that's just an honorary title for them, because look how small they are by comparison to the world religions. You see, as they come in down at that smaller number, the reason we speak of them as a major religion because we know them, because they're in Old Testament, and because they're famous even to this day all around the world. For example, some of the oppression that they faced, the Holocaust, Nazi Germany, and such as that. I mean, they've made a name for themselves, but if you're looking at their size, relatively small and insignificant as far as world population. And then I threw in some others there for you just so you can get a feel for how it comes with world religions and such as that. Now, let me just mention some of the odd ones I threw in there just so you can get some numbers. I mentioned, for example, the Mormon church. Now, Mormon is an example of, within the Christian umbrella, exactly how do you label them. I mean, they have moved away from Christian teaching so much, the Orthodox Center, and we studied them last year, you may recall, that a lot of books will just put them in a cult category, a spin-off that's gotten far away from the original teachings and practices of Christianity. Of course, they would deny that. Sometimes, though, some will say, I'm not even sure they're part of Christianity anymore. I think they're their own separate thing. And occasionally you'll have a Mormon writer who makes that claim. Really, we have moved away and onto something even better, and so it's a standalone. But their current president is actually now trying to say, no, actually, I think we belong back under. They waver back and forth as to how they even categorize themselves. But look at their number. Whatever category that Mormons put themselves or we put them, still, they are a significant size. And so as you look at their size in the millions, compared to all the rest of these second tier of the groups, That's pretty good. Jehovah's Witnesses about half of where they are. So 15 million, and Jehovah's Witnesses coming in at about half. Now, I had to give you one last world category because this is growing. And that's a category where it gets labeled different ways, depending on who's asking the question, who's doing the census. But whether it's labeled as, are you an atheist, are you agnostic, are you a non-religious, are you a secular, and there's some other terms that are used, you say, well, that's about up to 1 billion. Now, that's up rivaling Buddhism, Hinduism, and Islam. This is a significant number. You're atheist. I don't believe there is a God. You're agnostic. I'm not sure. There may be, there may not be, but I'm not sure, which means I have no religious practice because I'm not sure there's a God to be honoring with a religion. Your non-religious is declaring whatever spirituality I have, whatever faith I have, I don't work it into a religion. I'm not part of any religion. It's my own private thing. And then the secular is another way of saying that whatever's out there, and it doesn't matter what's out there, we're down here. And we have to make life work because we're all that there is. There's no God down here. And so secular is, then you just form a worldview as to how we will deal with the world and what we'll make of the world. Now, you put those out there on a survey and you'll find more and more people marking those things. And I'll tell you who's really marking them now. It's some of our kids. As when they get out of church, they're not so sure they believe in a God now. And so they're going to mark non-religious, for example, or agnostic, two of the very popular categories that they're now marking. And they were raised in church, or if not even in church, raised in some faith, but they're not so sure they believe their parents, their grandparents' faith. Now, that's the world numbers. Look at the U.S. numbers. By like token, Christianity is still number one. Coming in at a good number, about 160 million. If you want to know where's that fit in the U.S. population, that's about 325 million, so we're coming in at about half. Okay, about half of America is Christian. And while at one time we could have legitimately said this is a Christian nation as the first founders, we're bringing the Christian faith here to this land. That's not necessarily the case any longer. We may be number one by a significant margin, but there's half of the country that is something else. Once again, we still got room for evangelism, don't we? For sharing the name of Christ. There's a lot of people out there that aren't under the label of Christian. Now, look who comes in at number 2. Where'd they come from? The Jews are up at the number 2 slot. Now, it's still not anywhere close to where Christianity is. Christianity is still going to be way above everyone else in the numbers game here in the United States, but Judaism comes in at that significant number, about 1.6 million. Now, think about this because you can probably figure this one out. Wonder why the United States has such a large population of Jews. Well, you know what happened back in the 40s and the 50s. See, as they're fleeing from the countries there where they're being persecuted by the Nazi Germans, they're finding safe refuge. And this was a safe refuge. We welcomed them to our shores. And so New York City, Miami Beach, wherever, they settled in large numbers, and thus they became number 2 in the United States. And I'll tell you this, we'll get to studying modern American Judaism so you can know more about them. The number here larger than the number in Israel. If you thought that was the number 1 place to find people of the Jewish faith, no, here's the number 1 place. Israel will be smaller than here. I'll also tell you this as just a tease for down the road when we get to Judaism, modern Judaism. The modern version of the Jewish faith, not quite what you read in the Old Testament. Think about it. They've had centuries after centuries for change to take place, for it to evolve into something different. Because remember, they go back to the time of Moses, about 1,400 or so years, even before Jesus, and even then, in those centuries, it kept changing from what Moses said in the first place. And then 2,000 years later, they've changed a lot. There's a number of things the Old Testament teaches that a modern Jew would not necessarily believe or practice. And so that's why when I teach you, I'm not going to just give you Old Testament class. I'm going to show you modern Judaism and what they today believe and what they today practice. And in many ways, it's significant. Now, look who's come in at number 3. So at number 3, who's there? Well, you know who's there. Islam. Now, look at their number, 1.1 million. Let me tell you something about that number. First, it's not terribly big compared to Christianity, or terribly big to the U.S. population, 325 million. See, sometimes you might get the impression they're everywhere. That's still a small number when you talk about everywhere. It's not a significant force yet in numbers. And so if you do see a mosque go up here or a mosque go up there, and that makes you have this sense of a lot of Muslims, still, in the numbers game, it's still a small number yet that have migrated here and brought their faith with them, or the conversions that have happened here. But it's a growing number is the key. The number is growing, and that's where we get into the debates about immigration and things like that. The concerns about terrorists, and it's a murky water to even wade into that. You know, you sometimes better just stand on the sideline and just watch, because people get passionate and involved in that debate. And the fears they have, but the welcoming heart that others will have. And so I'll just tell you, a lot of that talk about what are we doing about immigration, about Muslims, and about extremists, here's what the numbers are right now. It's still a relatively small number, but a growing number. Now, of course, as you know, it doesn't take just a couple of guys in a plane, and they become significant all of a sudden, right? As well as any other terrorist of any faith religion would do. Now, back to our numbers game, look who comes in at number 4. It's Buddhists. Now, Buddhists were number 4 in the world religion, but look what they did. They slipped past Hinduism. Hinduism was bigger in the world, but Buddhists slip in and get ahead of them in the U.S. Let me tell you why that is. Buddhism is trendy. Buddhism is catchy. There are pockets of our country where it is a fashionable thing to be a Buddhist. And so I'm going to have to do a lesson for you on Buddhism at some point, and not just simply what they believe in practice. It takes me a long time just to go through the well-known celebrity Americans that are Buddhists. Because here's the way Buddhism works. Buddhism claims, don't think of us as a religion. Think of us as a philosophy of life that you can attach to any religion you want. And that's why we've got celebrities who are something/Buddhist. And so, for example, Harrison Ford can be a Methodist Buddhist and go to his Methodist church and still practice Buddhism, and on and on and on. There are a ton of Buddhists, and they're popular in the cultural elite areas of our country. Universities, a university professor who's not even sure about his belief in God, because you can be an atheist and be a Buddhist. Not even sure that he believes in a God. He says, I'm agnostic, but he's an agnostic Buddhist. And thus university students will get exposed to some of that, as well as then in the arts and such as that. So I'm going to tell you more about Buddhism at some point, and you'll get a feel for why it is that in some quarters they're attractive and they're growing. Now in Eastern North Carolina, I suspect they're not catching on yet. I don't think we particularly care. We go eat at Bojangles and get our biscuit and our tea, right? We're not into Buddhism as such here. But there are places where they are. So they come in at the number 4. Hinduism coming in behind that. And once again, I told you, Hinduism does not evangelize well. It doesn't export well. What you have is you have Indians who migrate to the U.S., jobs and such as that, and they remain Hindu, and that's where Hinduism makes it into our country. Now, when you drop below that, once again, the numbers will tell whatever tale they tell. So I've got to give you the Mormons once again. They're still a significant number. Here in the United States, that's a good number for them. Now, let me tell you about that number, though. You compare that to something we know sitting right here. Church of Christ, if you're wondering, so how big is the Church of Christ in the United States? We must be big. We come in somewhere close to 1.5 million. Compare that to Mormons. Mormons still got us beat. And Mormons started about the same time. Church of Christ is really coming together in this thing called the Restoration Movement. I'm going to teach you about that later, some of that history. But as that's happening early 1800s, Joseph Smith doing his thing early 1800s, and they went past us, still growing to this day. If you compare it to disciples, if any of you came from disciples, Christian church background, disciples numbering right now somewhere just above the 1 million, but below that 1.5 million, lost some numbers over the last several decades. If you are familiar with the a cappella, the non-instrumental Church of Christ. They're somewhere clocking about 1.5, 1.6. Are you getting the idea? Sometimes the fellowship that we know still coming in is much smaller than what the Mormons are. They still are a significant number. Now, I threw Unitarians and Universalists in just for fun. I threw them in because while a lot of your American denominations, Baptist, Methodist, whatever, will clock in at 1 million, 2 million, 3 million, 4 million. That's pretty good numbers. The Southern Baptists are the big ones, coming in closer to a 20-something million. But still, most of them coming in at the 1, 2, 3, 4 million. Unitarian Universalists, they've been holding their own. In fact, they do a little bit of growth, coming in just shy of 1 million. Now, why is that significant? because of what it is they teach. Unitarians teach there is no Trinity. There's just God. Forget that Jesus Christ is Son of God. Forget the Holy Spirit is some kind of person who does anything for us at all. There is just God. And so they're anti-Trinity in a strong way. The Trinity is a false doctrine. That's so different to what we traditionally associate with Christianity. You wouldn't expect it to pick up any steam and catch on, but they've grown in the last 2 centuries, and they've reached that far. We'll see if they go any further. Now, Universalists, that's a closely related idea, and that's the idea that there is no hell, and technically not really a heaven per se, that really whatever is the fate of mankind, we all go to the same place. Whatever that is, we all go. So don't separate it in 2 categories and describe those 2 categories. Whatever happens is what happens to us all. And whether it's be a blessed place or a miserable place or no place at all, we just disappear, we all go to the same fate. That's universalism. That's actually attractive to some, and thus it gets a little bit of growth. And so I just gave you their numbers just in case you're curious. And then last but not least, we're running about 27 million if we put them all together. We're back to our atheist, our agnostic, non-religious, secular, whatever it may be. And so that's a pretty good number. That's a number worth noting. Because that number, actually, every time I go back and check the latest numbers, that one keeps growing. That one keeps moving up. And so, for example, the last 20, 30 years I've been looking at Church of Christ, our numbers stayed about the same, 1.5 million. It's not budging. I look at the Baptists and Methodists, and I'll sometimes see with the Southern Baptists slight growth. The American Baptists, nope, coming down, so it balances out. Methodists, everybody, I'm watching everybody stay about the same or dropping back. This number keeps growing every time I look at it. More and more people are opting out of religion and religious faith, at least any kind of public religious faith. They're doing something else. So once again, we got concerns as people want to share the name of Christ with others. We've got concerns as we look at the numbers. Okay, now with that as just an idea of where things are in the numbers, let me give you really a theology of religion. That is to say, what are we as Christians to make of all these other religions that are out there in this world? Now, first, let me tell you, as we think through them and try to understand them, we always want to be kind and gracious. Jesus was loving and gracious to everybody, even if they were dead wrong. We got to learn how to be like Jesus, right? Because we want to argue. We want to debate. We sometimes come off pretty hateful. We always got to come off as people of love and charity, the love of God and the love of Christ. Because if we ever want to have a dialogue that could lead to a better understanding and bring them something that's a truth they need to know, we've got to work the way we discuss in dialogue, right? The way we even talk about them, third person, when they're not even here. So I always caution you that way. That's what I'll try to do as I'm teaching their beliefs and practices. Now, as you size them up, though, so how do they stand in light of what the Scriptures teach? Let me first say this. All of mankind is, by nature, religious. It is within our DNA to be seeking for something greater than us. Now, first, if you just do a study of the human race, do sociology, social groups, people groups through the ages. Do anthropology, ancient people groups. Here's what you'll find. All through history, people have been religious. They've believed in some kind of divine power, some kind of deity, some kind of God or gods. We have not yet discovered a people group, and they were atheists. They had no religion, no faith. There was nothing higher. Now, we haven't found that group. We haven't found anything comparable to our modern days. You know, we're quite different today in some ways. We got ideas I'm not sure how many people thought before, but we're thinking them now. They're free and they're out there on the internet. They're on Facebook, right? And so today, now it's popular to say, I don't believe, I don't believe, I don't believe. But throughout most of history, people believed in something. There was something there. And so you'll find that's been the trend. It's the way we're wired. Now, why? Well, this is where we got different theories. And some will talk about, well, how this and that has influenced it, but I'll tell you the way the Scriptures describe why we are where we are. And that's this, it's hard not to believe in some kind of creator. It's hard not to look at this world and this universe and not think there's something bigger than us. We can't be the max in size and in ability. There's got to be something more powerful, more knowledgeable, something bigger than us. That's how the Scriptures describe it time and time again. Take, for example, Psalm 19. Psalm 19, David says, the heavens are telling the glory of God. The firmament, the sky, is declaring His glory and His praise. It says night after night and day after day, you'll hear the voice of God, the words of God, and then he stops and says, actually, you're not going to hear a sound. It's not going to be actual words, and yet the heavens are talking about God all the time. And when you figure out what the poet's saying, what he's basically saying is this. When you look at creation, creation talks, not with words, but with conclusions I draw as I look at creation and I conclude, somebody's got to be responsible for all this. This is too big. This is too powerful. This is too creative. It's too intricate in design to just be chance and it just happened. It looks like a designer designed it. A creator made it. That's what he's doing in Psalm 19. Now, he gives a case in point. His case in point is the sun. And so he's a poet now, so he uses poetic imagery. He describes the sun as every morning he gets up, he walks out of his tent, he stretches, it's the start of another day, and then he gets ready and he races across the sky, of course, coming from the east and setting in the west, and he brightens up the day, and then at night he goes back in his tent and he sleeps, and then he gets up the next morning. And as he tells that story in poetry form, what he's also saying is what the Hebrews actually taught. In fact, we'll find it in other people groups as well. And the question is this, is it a coincidence that the sun does what it does? That we see it come up from the same side each day and go down the same side? It's not like every day, well, I wonder where it's coming today. No, we know where it's coming. And we even know how it slightly moves as the earth itself is making its movements. And we don't have to guess when it's coming tomorrow morning. I don't know, maybe 9:30, 10. I don't know. No, we know. It's in the newspaper, down to the minute. The precision of the way things operate, and nature is filled with precision. So much precision that when we send a rocket to the moon, we don't do like you and I do if I'm trying to hit a moving object and I kind of estimate. No, basically they can map this thing, not only hit the moon, but even hit where they want it on the moon as they're landing the ship. You see, there's a precision to nature, not to mention intricate design. Designed so that we have our best minds with best computers trying to create some of the things nature already has. Like to create an artificial eye, so that if you lose your eyesight, we just put another eye in. They do that on TV and the movies, right? We'd like to do it one day in real life. Meantime, we're working on it, but you know what? It's already there. It's there, and that just happened by chance. We're still trying to make it happen. So that's what people have always thought. They look at creation and reason back to a creator. How else do you explain all this? That's what Psalm 19 is talking about. Paul does the same thing when he preaches. Acts 14, he's in the town of Lystra. Now, Lystra is a very pagan town, and Paul and Barnabas arrive. And when they do, and they start preaching, and they'll do a few healing miracles, this and that, get people's attention. Next thing you know, the crowd, they come running this village. They're gathering around. They're bringing things, and it takes them a moment. They finally figure out they think we're gods. In fact, they do think it's Apollo and Mercury, and they've come from the heavens, and they're bringing sacrifices and gifts. And that's where Paul says, no, stop. So, no, we're men just like you. We're not gods. We're men. And we want to move you away from these kind of worthless things to something real. We want to point you in the direction of the real God, the God who created the heavens and the earth and everything that's on the earth. And this is the God who in ages past was quiet and silent, and you didn't know about him. You never heard from him. But he didn't leave himself completely without witness, because all the time he was being quiet with words, he was doing things. He was showing you kindness. He gave you rain when you wanted rain for your crops. He gave you the crops at harvest time. He gave you food to eat. He gave you your families. He gave you joy. I mean, he's always been good to you. And you knew he was out there. You just didn't know much about him. I'm here today to tell you about him. That's how Paul preached. And they could nod their heads and agree. They always believed someone was blessing them. They just didn't know who. Paul says in Romans chapter 1, describing the people of this world, people that don't have a Bible, they don't have a prophet, a preacher. They don't have all the knowledge you and I have. But still, here's what Paul says about them. He says, God has made known to them things that can be made known. He has revealed himself. He's revealed his invisible qualities through things they could see. He showed them his power. He showed them his nature through the things that he made. And so really people are without excuse for not believing in God. They may not know his name, may not know much about him, but you can't help but believe there's something out there. You see how the scriptures teach what actually real life teaches as well, and that is this: people are religious. It's just part of nature. Here's what Ecclesiastes says. Ecclesiastes 3:11 says, God put eternity in our hearts so none of us can really fathom the beginning or the end of things. He put within us a sense of eternity. You know what that means? We know that what happens on this world, you live and you die. You get so many years and you die. Everybody does. And yet, you know what's always in the back of our minds? But I wonder if there's something after death. I don't know that that's the end. I think there's something else, something much further beyond. And whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, whether it's a day of judgment or a free pass, I think there's something else. I don't think death is the end of the story. Where did we get that idea? He put a sense of eternity in our heart, something beyond the present. Or Romans 2, Paul talks about the conscience. We all got it. Paul says even Gentiles who don't know the law of God, they don't know the Scriptures, they don't know Moses, they don't know any of that. Still, it says they still have a sense of right and wrong that matches ours. Don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal, don't commit adultery. You know, there's a general ethics that floats around all through ancient times, and it's very similar. When you watch the codes of ethics of the different people groups and see how much they match up to what Moses himself also taught with the Holy Spirit, everybody's got this sense of right and sense of wrong. Paul calls it the conscience. Where'd that come from? Paul says the Creator put that in each one of us. That's one of the arguments we often use for the existence of God. It's the moral argument. How is it that there is even a concept of morality, of right and wrong, and of accountability? I might have to pay for this one day. Where'd that come from except someone who is the foundation of morality and right and wrong? You get where I'm going? Everybody just has this innate sense there's something bigger than us, something I may be accountable to someday, something that has a control over my destiny. Now, people are religious by nature. That's a good thing. God made us like that. But look at number 2. It's also pretty easy for us to mess things up. You know, you give us something good and we'll mess it up for long, won't we? That's just our human nature. We just mess things up. So give us a truth, and before you know it, we'll corrupt that truth into something else. And that's been the history of mankind with this religious impulse that we have. We know there's a God of some sort. We know there's a creator. We can't be content with just something general. We want to fill in the gaps. We want to define, and next thing you know, we're defining in ways that are different than the truth. Because we didn't wait for God to tell us who He is and what He is, and thus we just made it up ourselves as we imagined God. And thus, I'll tell you the mistakes that most religions make. I got them listed for you. Number 1, a corrupted view of God. They can't be content with just believing in the idea of God and thanking Him for whoever you are and whatever you are. No, we want to define Him. And so they'll create polytheism, many gods, because after all, they're trying to imagine how can one God run all this? It must take a team. So they imagine polytheism. That's offensive to God. He says, I am one. Or they'll go to animism. Animism is where there's a God spirit in every living thing, every man and woman, every animal, even sometimes down to the plants. If it's living, it's got a God spirit in it, and all of us together are God. That's really giving us too much credit. We're not God. There's something out there that's bigger than all of us together. Or they'll go other directions as well as they try to imagine God, but in doing so, they corrupt the image of God, and, well, it's offensive to Him. We have to get them back to a truth. In addition to that, is usually an inadequate view of Christ. They'll look at Jesus, and most religions like Jesus. He's actually in their teaching somewhere. And we'll talk about Islam and what they do with Jesus, but most of them have a place for Jesus because most of them like prophets. And Jesus is just one of the many prophets. But now more than that, no deity, Son of God kind of thing. That's beyond their understanding. And the death on the cross, what a shame. They killed such a good man. Imagine what he could have accomplished if he'd have lived. That's a view of Christ as what a shame. And we see it as that's our hope, that's our salvation, the death of Christ as our sacrifice. Also, there will be some other things that will miss the mark. Like, for example, a faulty view of sin and salvation. One of the key things you'll notice in all religions is they don't really get the concept of grace. They'll oftentimes get the concept of right and wrong. They'll get the concept of a God who is angry. In fact, you may be recycling that reincarnation wheel for 100 times before you ever get it right. Boy, that's a pain. They get a lot of that kind of stuff, sin, anger. What they don't get is grace, where God can give you the second chance, can even step down in the person of the Son and take your place and pay the price. The grace concept just doesn't seem to show up like it does in Christianity. And then there's always some presumptive authority. Someone who steps up and says, I'm a prophet of the real God. Or here's the writings of the real God. And listen, there are tests, common sense tests, of a real prophet and a false prophet, of a true, holy, sacred scripture and a false claim. In fact, you'll find those same tests listed in the Bible in different passages because Christianity claims our prophets and our Scripture pass the test. That's why they'll mention what the tests are so you can see whether or not we pass the test. Now, I'll give you an example of the test. Moses gives this one in the book of Deuteronomy. If a guy claims to be a prophet and can predict the future, then write down what he says so that when that day comes, if what he says doesn't happen the way he said it, he's a false prophet. Obviously, he doesn't have the power he claimed to have. Ignore everything the guy says because he's a false. And that's why the Scriptures tell you that rule, because then they want you to go back and see if what Isaiah predicts and what Jeremiah predicts and Daniel, did it come true or not come true. They want you to do the test and see whether or not our prophets can pass the common sense test. That's the prediction test. There's other tests as well. And then there's some more things I can tell you about the religions, but I'll tell you what really is the fundamental crime, if you will, that the prophets talk about, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and that is idolatry. Idolatry is the thing that probably upsets God about as much as anything at all. Now, you think about idolatry. You take God and you put him in the form of some kind of image. And then you set that image up, and then you bow down and worship, but you use it as an object to show your devotion to whoever's out there. You're just doing your good intentions. And God gets angry about idolatry in the Old Testament Scriptures. It is an abomination in his sight. Why? What bothers him with idolatry? Actually, Deuteronomy already told the Jews why you're to never go that route. Not with the pagan gods. Don't do that with the real God. Don't ever put the real God in an image. Now, why not? Well, Moses explained it in long version. Paul gave it in short version, Romans 1. What they did was they took the glory of the incorruptible God, God in all his glory, and then they brought it down and squeezed it in to the image of a creature, whether it be the image of an animal, a bird, even of a man. And they said, behold, there's God. And God says in heaven, are you kidding? That's so small, so puny compared to me. I am this huge, glorious thing, and you've made me look tiny. Because what you did was put me in an image. I created that image. That's a small act of mine. I can do bigger things than that. And you made me look small. You diminished me. And that's why he's offended. And it doesn't matter what you put there, he's offended. And then Paul goes on to say in verse 25, he says, they exchanged the truth for a lie. In doing so, they were bowing down in front of a creature instead of the creator of that creature. Idolatry has always upset God because it doesn't matter what picture, what carving you put out there and say, well, that's God, it always looks so much smaller than him. He takes great offense. Now, what I'm saying is the way the Scriptures describe world religions is they have started off with some good ideas. They got this right idea. There's a God out there. They want to know him. That's what Paul says in the book of Acts. He says they want to know him. They desire to know him in Acts chapter 17. But they corrupted the truth of God. Which brings me to a conclusion. And that is this. According to the Scriptures, there is no salvation outside of Jesus Christ. And thus, you should view the world as lost, and they need us to send the gospel to them so they have a chance to know faith in Christ, and the salvation comes from that. You know what Paul says, all have sinned and fallen short. That covers everyone. Here's what else Paul also says. Paul describes the condition of the lost world even as he is becoming an evangelist. He tells his own story of Acts chapter 26 when Jesus talked to him on the road to Damascus. Jesus says, I got a mission for you. I'm going to send you to the Gentiles, to the nations, to the peoples out there. Those are your people with all the other religions of the world. He says, I'm sending you them. Here's why. I want you to turn them from darkness to light, from the kingdom and power of Satan to the kingdom and power of God. See, that's not a phrase that describes, oh, all roads lead to the same God and the same heaven. No, they're in darkness and need to come to the light. They're under the delusion and power of Satan. They need to come to the truth and power of God. When Paul writes to the church of Ephesus in Ephesians chapter 2, he says, remember what you used to be like? There was a time that you were outside of everything that God offers you today. He said there was a time when you were separated from Christ. The people who know Christ, they're the ones that were part of Christ, not you. You were separated from Christ. You were not a citizen of the kingdom. You weren't part of the covenants and the hopes and the promises. He said you had no hope. You had no God. In other words, the Scriptures paint a bleak picture of people practicing their religions. We're such kind-hearted people today. We like to think, well, yeah, but they're trying. And they don't know any better. And maybe somehow, some way, God's going to slip them into heaven anyway. Listen, let me tell you how Judgment Day works. Judgment Day works however God wants it to work, and he'll do what he wants, right? And we really don't want to decide for him in advance because I'm not sure we have the knowledge base to do so. So listen, if in your heart you want to hope that God's got some way to slip a whole bunch of these people into heaven, you can hope it in your heart. But listen, folks, right up here, as you're trying to read the Scriptures and then act and do, you need to see the world as lost, and they need to hear about Jesus Christ from me and you. Think about it if you turn that around. If you take what you hope in your heart that somehow God's going to do something good for these people, something gracious, if you put that up in your head and that becomes your theology, then there's no urgency in sending mission money overseas or sending missionaries or this and that, because just leave them like they are, a good Buddhist, a good Hindu, and they'll get to heaven anyway. See how that works? You don't ever want to turn that into the way you actually think and act. And I think that'll be contrary to the way the Scriptures describe. No, you got to think they're lost. And our church needs to do something about that. We need to reach out in the best ways we can and get these people a chance to know Jesus Christ before it's too late. So that's why I say, do what you want here as far as the heart. That's just you feeling what you're feeling, guessing what you're guessing, having whatever opinion you want. Hey, do that all you want to your heart's content, but leave that right there. And then as you think, as you speak, as you do, let's put before people the dire situation that people are in. And let's try to show them a truth that comes in Jesus Christ. And that would be my theology of the religions.